Are any Nazi leaders still alive or living on through hidden networks and inherited ideologies? Long after the Third Reich's fall, fugitives disappeared, old guards resurfaced in courtrooms, and extremist shadows found new forms. This is the chilling story of how Nazism didn't die. It mutated and still echoes through time. Adolf Hitler, Heinrich Himmler, Joseph Goebbels and Hermann Göring were gone by 1945, dead by suicide or sentenced in post-war trials. But the legacy of the Third Reich didn't die with them. In the decades that followed, its dark influence slipped through borders, bloodlines and belief systems. Some former Nazi personnel simply disappeared, vanishing into quiet retirements or slipping through Vatican escape routes to South America. Others, like former camp guards and secretaries, are only now facing justice in the twilight of their lives. Irmgard Fürchner, a 97-year-old who once typed orders at Stutthof, stood trial in 2021, proving the reckoning isn't over. But there's a third layer, perhaps the most unsettling. The ideology itself, unburied by time, still breathes through modern extremist networks, revisionist movements, and even within families of former Nazi elites. In this video, we explore from the bunker's collapse to courtroom battles of today, from fleeing war criminals to digital age radicalism. This isn't just a post-war history, it's a live, evolving narrative. Because when hatred adapts, so must remembrance. And the past, left unchallenged, has a dangerous way of repeating itself. Fall of the Führer's inner circle. April 30th, 1945. The heart of Berlin was reduced to rubble. Soviet artillery roared in the distance as chaos unfolded above ground. But beneath the Reich Chancellery, in a dim, claustrophobic underground bunker, the final days of the Third Reich played out like a twisted Greek tragedy. Adolf Hitler, once the iron-fisted ruler of Nazi Germany, now a trembling shell of a man, paced obsessively through damp concrete corridors. His dreams of a 1,000-year empire were reduced to a matter of hours. The Red Army had encircled Berlin. His closest allies had either fled, turned against him, or waited like ghosts for the inevitable. On April 29th, in a quiet, almost absurd ceremony, Hitler married his longtime companion, Eva Braun. Less than 40 hours later, both would be dead. He swallowed cyanide, pulled the trigger, and had his body burned per his final instructions. Eva died alongside him, drinking poison without protest. Just meters away, their aides waited to cremate the bodies, pouring gasoline in a desperate effort to deny the Soviets the ultimate prize. The Führer was dead, but his inner circle lived on, scattering like embers from a dying fire. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister and one of his most fanatical devotees, refused to escape. He remained in the bunker with his wife Magda and their 6 children. Convinced that life without National Socialism was not worth living, the Goebbels family made a chilling choice. On May 1st, Magda drugged the children, aged 4 to 12, and crushed cyanide capsules between their teeth. Later that day, she and Joseph ascended to the surface, where they too took poison and were shot by an SS orderly. Their bodies were burned in the garden above the bunker. It was a grotesque loyalty play, one that revealed the cult-like fanaticism still gripping some of Hitler's closest lieutenants, even as the regime crumbled around them. Hermann Göring, once commander of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, had a different end. As the Third Reich collapsed, Göring attempted to assume control, citing a 1941 decree naming him the heir in case Hitler became incapacitated. But instead of seizing power, his ambition backfired. Furious, Hitler stripped him of all titles and ordered his arrest. Göring was detained by the SS and narrowly avoided execution. Captured by Allied forces shortly thereafter, Goering stood trial at Nuremberg, where he displayed intelligence, arrogance, and chilling indifference. He was sentenced to death, but committed suicide by cyanide hours before his scheduled execution. Even in death, Goering defied the system, robbing the world of closure. If any figure symbolized the cold machinery of the Holocaust, it was Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS and architect of the final solution. In April 1945, Himmler attempted to negotiate a surrender to the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. When Hitler discovered the betrayal, he was livid. Himmler was stripped of power, declared a traitor, and expelled from the Nazi Party. After fleeing Berlin, Himmler disguised himself in a Wehrmacht uniform and attempted to vanish into the chaos. But British forces captured him in May. During interrogation, he bit down on a cyanide capsule hidden in his mouth and died almost instantly. Like Hitler and Goering, Himmler escaped the courtroom and public reckoning. Justice, in his case, was stolen by a single bitter pill. Martin Bormann, Hitler's private secretary, was perhaps the most enigmatic figure in the inner circle. He rarely appeared in public, yet wielded immense power behind closed doors, controlling access to Hitler, directing internal policies, and shaping party strategy. Bormann was last seen fleeing the Führerbunker on May 2, 1945, with SS Dr. Ludwig Stumpfegger. For decades, he was rumored to have escaped to South America, like many former Nazis. Nazi hunters chased leads across the globe. Then, in 1972, construction workers unearthed 2 skeletons near Berlin's Lehrter train station. Dental records confirmed the remains belonged to Bormann and Stumpfegger. The autopsy suggested Bormann had committed suicide, either by poison or injury during escape. But the mystery surrounding his disappearance persisted, fueling decades of conspiracy theories and distrust around the fate of Nazi elites. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and Minister of Armaments, was among the few who survived and served time. At Nuremberg, he admitted moral guilt and accepted responsibility for the Nazi regime's crimes, though he denied knowledge of the Holocaust's scale. Many historians dispute his claims. As the head of Germany's war production, Speer used forced labor and was deeply embedded in the Nazi power structure. Still, his courtroom demeanor, intelligence, and apparent remorse led to a 20-year sentence, far less than many of his colleagues. Upon his release in 1966, Speer published best-selling memoirs and became a controversial figure in post-war Germany. Some saw him as a man haunted by regret, others as a manipulator who reinvented himself to evade full accountability. His survival and public rehabilitation reflect a broader truth, that some architects of atrocity can rebrand themselves, and history often struggles with absolution. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's longtime deputy, made one of the war's most bizarre moves. In 1941, without Hitler's approval, Hess flew solo to Scotland in an attempt to broker peace with Britain. The mission failed, and he was captured. Hess remained imprisoned for the rest of his life, first in Britain, then at the Nuremberg trials, and finally in Spandau prison in Berlin. He served a life sentence and became the sole inmate of the prison after 1966. In 1987, at age 93, Hess died under suspicious circumstances. Officially, he committed suicide by hanging. But conspiracy theories emerged, alleging murder by Western intelligence or covert Nazi sympathizers seeking to silence him. To this day, debates over his death remain unresolved. Was it suicide, or the final chapter of a conspiracy too long in the making? Beyond the inner circle, dozens of high-ranking Nazis met varying fates. Some, like Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the RSHA and one of the highest-ranking SS officials captured, were executed at Nuremberg. Others died in combat, committed suicide, or vanished. but many managed to blend back into post-war society. SS officers, generals, and bureaucrats slipped through the cracks. The chaos of Germany's surrender, divided occupation zones, and Cold War priorities made accountability a logistical nightmare. Some changed names, others claimed ignorance, a few simply weren't recognized. It's estimated that over 10,000 former Nazis fled Europe using escape routes known as rat lines, organized with the help of sympathetic clergy, Red Cross passports, and loopholes in Allied bureaucracy. Many settled in South America, living under aliases and raising families far from the ashes of Berlin. The inner circle may have fallen, but the web they spun stretched much further. The story of Hitler's inner circle is not one of absolute endings. It's a story of suicides without trials, escapes without names, and guilt without full confession. The bunker didn't just bury bodies, it buried truths. The leaders of the Third Reich left behind more than destruction. They left unanswered questions, institutional damage, and ideological poison that would take decades to confront, and still lingers today. In the end, only a few faced true justice. Others controlled their own fate through pills, guns, and well-timed disappearances. And some, like Speer, emerged from the wreckage not as villains, but as narrators of their own sanitized history. The fall of the Führer's inner circle marked the end of Nazi Germany, but it did not end the reckoning. Justice served, Nuremberg and beyond. The war had ended, but justice had only just begun. In 1945, as Allied forces uncovered the horrors of concentration camps, mass graves, and execution sites, the world faced a question unlike any before. How do you bring justice to men responsible for crimes so vast, so evil, that they seem beyond legal definition? The answer was historic: a courtroom. A city still scarred by war. A global stage that would make Nazi leaders answer not just for war, but for the darkest chapter in modern humanity. On November 20th, 1945, in the city of Nuremberg, the International Military Tribunal opened its doors. This wasn't just a trial, it was a global reckoning. For the first time in history, world leaders were being held individually accountable for aggression, genocide, and crimes against humanity. In the dock sat 24 of the highest-ranking surviving figures of the Third Reich, men like Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, Alfred Rosenberg, Joachim von Ribbentrop, and Albert Speer. These weren't low-level guards or soldiers. These were the architects of terror, the masterminds behind the Nazi regime. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Film reels captured by Allied forces showed skeletal survivors in death camps. Paper trails detailed the logistics of extermination. Eyewitnesses gave harrowing testimony, recounting gas chambers, forced labor, and systematic murder. There was no room for denial anymore. The evidence spoke with a voice the world could not ignore. And for the Nazi elite, the old excuse, "I was just following orders," was no longer enough. On October 1st, 1946, the sentences were handed down. 12 of the men were sentenced to death by hanging. These included Göring, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Rosenberg, and Hans Frank. 7 others received lengthy prison terms from 10 years to life. 3 were acquitted. But even in the face of justice, some found a way to escape it. Hermann Göring, once Hitler's chosen successor, cheated the noose. Hours before his scheduled execution, he bit down on a hidden cyanide capsule, dying in his cell. To this day, no one knows exactly how he smuggled the poison past Allied guards. His final act, one last moment of control, deprived the world of closure. The rest were hanged at Nuremberg prison in the early hours of October 16th. Their bodies were cremated and scattered in secret, so no grave could become a shrine. Even in death, the Allies understood. Memory could be weaponized if left unchecked. Despite its imperfections, The Nuremberg trial created a legacy. It proved that even the most powerful could be held to account. It showed that justice, though slow and imperfect, was still possible. But this was just the first act. After the main trial ended, 12 additional proceedings followed in Nuremberg between 1946 and 1949. These were lesser known, but no less important. They focused not on generals, but on the machinery of Nazism, the people who made genocide possible from behind desks, in hospitals, and in boardrooms. One of the most chilling was the doctors' trial, where 23 Nazi physicians and administrators were charged for conducting gruesome medical experiments on prisoners. These included freezing people to death, testing poisons, and performing amputations without anesthesia. Some of these so-called experiments were simply torture dressed up as science. Several were sentenced to death. Others received long prison terms. Then came the judges' trial, a confrontation with the legal system itself. Here, Nazi judges and Ministry of Justice officials were tried for turning courts into tools of tyranny. These were the men who enforced racial laws, sentenced dissidents, and used the rule of law to strangle freedom. It was a reminder that fascism doesn't just march, it legislates. Another critical proceeding was the IG Farben trial, which exposed how German corporations became complicit in genocide. IG Farben, a chemical conglomerate, not only used slave labor, but also manufactured Zyklon B, the gas used in extermination camps. Executives were found guilty, showing the world that profit and atrocity often walk hand in hand. These trials peeled back layers of the Nazi system. They showed how ordinary professions, medicine, law, business, could become instruments of evil when ethics are abandoned. And yet, not all were punished. Despite these trials, the truth remained grim. Thousands of perpetrators were never prosecuted. Mid-level SS officers, bureaucrats, camp guards, many simply vanished into the post-war chaos. Some hid in plain sight. Others used forged documents to slip across borders. Organized escape routes, known as rat lines, helped countless Nazis flee Europe. Operated by sympathetic clergy and exploiting Red Cross paperwork, these routes funneled fugitives into South America, the Middle East, and even North America. One of the most infamous escapees was Adolf Eichmann, the logistical mastermind behind the Holocaust's deportation trains. He disappeared after the war, living under a false identity in Argentina until Israeli agents kidnapped him in 1960. His televised trial and execution reignited public awareness and showed that the hunt was far from over. Others, like Josef Mengele, the notorious camp doctor known for his twin experiments at Auschwitz, were never caught. He died in Brazil in 1979, never answering for his crimes. The cold reality, the majority of Nazis who committed crimes at all levels escaped justice entirely. Just as the pursuit of justice began to gain momentum, a new global conflict emerged, the Cold War. And with it came compromises. In the West, former Nazis were seen less as war criminals and more as assets. The US launched Operation Paperclip, secretly recruiting over 1,600 German scientists and engineers to work on weapons, rockets, and intelligence. One of the most prominent was Wernher von Braun, who helped develop the V-2 rocket used to bomb London, and later helped America land on the moon. The Soviet Union did the same. Former Nazis were absorbed into East Germany's security services or sent to the USSR to work on military projects. In both East and West, justice became expendable in the name of strategy. Morality took a back seat to missiles. Inside Germany, the story was even more complicated. After the war, the Allies imposed a denazification program requiring Germans to fill out forms, attend hearings, and publicly declare their level of involvement. But as years passed, this process lost steam. Many Germans grew weary of being judged. Others saw former Nazis as necessary for rebuilding. By the early 1950s, Chancellor Konrad Adenauer allowed many ex-Nazis to return to public life. Judges, police officers, and bureaucrats who had enforced the Third Reich's laws now enforced democracy. It was a bitter pill for survivors and a sign that pragmatism had overtaken principle. Still, things began to shift in the 1960s. Young Germans, raised in silence about the war, started asking questions. The Frankfurt Auschwitz trials from 1963 to 1965 marked a turning point. For the first time, German prosecutors put former camp guards on trial on German soil. The trials shocked the nation. Many had never heard the word Auschwitz spoken aloud in their homes. A new generation demanded truth and accountability. Not everyone who deserved punishment received it. Many died free, many were never found. But the trials left behind something even more powerful than sentences. They left a blueprint. The Nuremberg trials defined crimes against humanity and introduced individual accountability into international law. These legal principles influenced the formation of the International Criminal Court, inspired tribunals for Rwanda and the Balkans, and remain the foundation of human rights law today. But perhaps more importantly, they forced the world to look evil in the eye and not look away. Germany's path toward atonement wasn't fast or easy, but through trials, remembrance, and education, it carved a space where truth could live. Laws were passed against Holocaust denial. Memorials were built. History was taught, without euphemism or evasion. The fight for justice didn't end in a courtroom. It continues in classrooms, museums, and memorials across the world. Late justice, camp staff in their 90s. Time doesn't heal all wounds, and for many Holocaust survivors, justice didn't come swiftly, if it came at all. As the decades passed, the world assumed the book on Nazi trials was closing. Most of the top commanders were long dead. Middle-tier figures had blended into society or vanished altogether. Prosecutors, worn down by bureaucracy, Cold War distractions, and public fatigue, let countless perpetrators slip by unnoticed. But then something changed. In the 2010s and 2020s, courtrooms in Germany began reopening files once thought forgotten. The defendants, not generals or ministers, but frail elderly individuals in their 90s, secretaries, bookkeepers, guards, men and women who had served quietly at concentration camps and death facilities far from the spotlight. Suddenly, the world was watching again. The most famous of these late trials began in 2015, when 94-year-old Oskar Gröning, a former SS officer known as the Accountant of Auschwitz, stood before a judge in Lüneburg, Germany. Gröning had worked at Auschwitz in the 1940s, not as a killer, but as a desk clerk. His job was to count money taken from prisoners and send it to SS headquarters. He also helped log stolen valuables, rings, watches, gold teeth, meticulously cataloguing the spoils of genocide. For decades, Gröning had lived quietly in northern Germany, raising a family and working as a bank clerk. His past caught up to him only after he publicly acknowledged his role in a 2005 interview, insisting he felt moral guilt, but didn't consider himself legally responsible. The court disagreed. In a landmark ruling, Gröning was found guilty of being an accessory to the murder of 300,000 people. The decision set a powerful precedent. Direct participation in killing was no longer required for conviction. Simply working at a death camp, knowingly facilitating its function, was enough. Gröning died in 2018 before serving his sentence. But his case sent shockwaves through the German legal system and beyond. In 2021, another stunning trial made headlines. This time, not for brutality, but for bureaucracy. Irmgard Fürchner, a 96-year-old woman, was brought before a German court, Her crime? Serving as a secretary to the commandant of the Stutthof concentration camp near modern-day Gdansk, Poland. Between 1943 and 1945, over 60,000 people died at Stutthof, gassed, starved, or shot. Furchner's role wasn't physical. She typed orders, handled correspondence, and organized the commandant's schedule. Yet prosecutors argued she was an integral part of the machinery of death. Her keystrokes, they said, enabled killing. Furchner became the first woman tried in decades for Nazi-era crimes. When her trial began, she made a brief attempt to escape, fleeing her retirement home just hours before proceedings were scheduled to start. She was later found, taken into custody, and eventually convicted. Though her sentence was suspended due to age and health, the symbolism was massive. It marked a definitive break from the old thinking that only direct killers deserved prosecution. Now, even administrative assistants could be held to account. The wave of late prosecutions largely began with one pivotal figure, John Demjanjuk. Demjanjuk, a Ukrainian-born former auto worker living in Ohio, was first accused in the 1980s of being Ivan the Terrible, a notorious gas chamber operator at Treblinka. He was extradited to Israel, tried and sentenced to death, only for new evidence to emerge proving mistaken identity. He returned to the US, stripped of his citizenship and faded from the headlines. But in 2009, Germany reopened the case, this time on new grounds. They charged Demjanjuk not as a monstrous killer, but as a guard at the Sobibor extermination camp. The argument? His mere presence made him complicit. In 2011, at age 91, he was convicted of being an accessory to 28,000 murders. He died before his appeal could be heard, but the legal precedent stood. For the first time, German courts embraced the idea of functional guilt, that serving in any role at a death camp made one accountable. That ruling opened the floodgates. Hundreds of old files were dusted off. Investigators began racing against time, searching for guards, typists, cooks, anyone still alive who had played a part. These trials sparked fierce public debate. Was it right to prosecute people who were now frail, wheelchair-bound, sometimes suffering from dementia? Some argued no. These individuals, they said, were just cogs in a larger machine. They had lived quiet lives for decades, caused no modern harm, and were unlikely to pose a threat. Pursuing them, critics claimed, was nothing more than symbolic vengeance. But others, especially survivors, felt differently. For them, the passage of time didn't lessen guilt, it magnified silence. Many had waited their entire lives for accountability. Their parents, siblings, and friends had been murdered without trial. Their communities were erased. As Holocaust survivor Eva Moses-Kor famously said after testifying against a former guard, "Forgiveness does not mean justice cannot be pursued. We can forgive, but we cannot forget, and we must never stop demanding the truth." Justice, even delayed by 70 years, still mattered. It validated memory. It named the unnamed. It reminded the world that complicity is not a footnote, it's a crime. Germany's willingness to prosecute these elderly individuals says as much about the present as it does about the past. For decades after World War II, the country struggled with its memory. Early post-war generations often looked away, clinging to the idea that only monsters committed atrocities. But these late trials shattered that illusion. They showed that ordinary people, clerks, nurses, guards, had participated. That silence was never innocence. And that history isn't something that lives only in books. It breathes in families, in courtrooms, in the quiet shame that travels through generations. These trials also reflect a changing legal and cultural landscape in Germany. In schools, Holocaust education is mandatory. Denying the genocide is a criminal offense. Memorials and museums dot the landscape, reminding citizens that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about remembrance. And as the survivor generation fades, the urgency to cement the truth becomes even more vital. Today, only a handful of Holocaust survivors remain alive. Fewer still can testify in court. Every new trial risks being the last. But what these late prosecutions prove is profound. The pursuit of justice has no expiration date. The human conscience doesn't forget. And history, though often buried, has a way of resurfacing, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. Whether it's a nonagenarian secretary, an accountant with ink-stained hands, or a long-retired camp guard, these individuals remind us that evil doesn't always arrive with a gun. Sometimes it comes with paperwork, or silence, or complicity disguised as obedience. And when those who enabled horror are finally named, no matter how late, the past takes one step closer to being truly understood. The Fugitives, Rumors and Realities. The Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, but not everyone who built it vanished in the fire. In the final days of World War II, as Berlin fell and Allied troops swept through Europe, a select group of Nazi officials quietly slipped through the cracks. They didn't surrender. They didn't stand trial. Instead, they disappeared into forests, across borders, and eventually into new lives. For decades, whispers followed them. Tales of Nazi generals living under false names in Argentina, of SS officers spotted in Chilean mountain towns, of secret compounds in Paraguay, protected by local authorities and foreign sympathizers. Some of these stories were fantasy, but many were real. This is the story of the fugitives, those who didn't fall with the bunker, but escaped into history's shadow. As the Allies advanced from the west and the Soviets closed in from the east, the remaining Nazi elite faced a terrible choice: face trial, commit suicide, or run. Many chose the third. They moved quickly and strategically. Some posed as refugees or wounded soldiers. Others relied on loyal networks, clergy members, business partners, or foreign allies to provide shelter and new identities. Many used forged Red Cross papers or benefited from bureaucratic chaos that allowed them to slip past border checks. This wasn't random, it was systemic. A vast web of escape routes began to take shape. Historians now refer to them as the rat lines, a secret network of corridors, safe houses, and sympathizers that funneled Nazis out of Europe. The most notorious rat lines stretched from Austria and southern Germany into Italy, where ports in Genoa and Rome became exit points to South America and the Middle East. Key figures in the Catholic Church, especially in post-war Italy, have been credibly linked to helping these fugitives, sometimes knowingly, sometimes under the guise of aiding refugees from communism. With the Cold War looming, Western intelligence agencies also played a murky role, prioritizing the fight against communism over justice for war crimes. The result? Thousands of Nazis fled Europe, some vanishing forever. No region became more associated with Nazi fugitives than South America. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Chile opened their doors, officially or unofficially, to waves of former Nazis and collaborators. Argentina, under President Juan Perón, became a key destination. A nationalist with authoritarian leanings, Perón admired fascist efficiency and viewed ex-Nazis as potential assets. He welcomed them with open arms, offering passports, jobs, and even land. It worked. High-ranking Nazis began arriving by ship and plane. They used aliases, adjusted their accents, and started new lives. Among them was Adolf Eichmann, one of the architects of the Holocaust. Eichmann had escaped US custody in 1946, posing as a low-level soldier. After hiding in Europe for several years, he fled to Argentina under the name Ricardo Clement. There, he lived a quiet, suburban life, working at a Mercedes-Benz factory and raising 4 children. But justice hadn't forgotten him. In May 1960, Israeli Mossad agents, tipped off by a survivor's son, tracked Eichmann down to a modest house in San Fernando, a suburb of Buenos Aires. Under the cover of night, they snatched him off the street and smuggled him onto an El Al plane, drugged, disguised as a flight attendant, and strapped to a seat. It was a dramatic operation, risky, illegal under Argentine law. But for Israel, it was a moral imperative. Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem became a global event. It was the first time Holocaust survivors told their stories to a global audience, day after day, in vivid detail. Millions watched or listened as Eichmann, expressionless in a glass booth, defended his actions by saying, "I was just following orders." He was found guilty and hanged in 1962. The trial marked a turning point. For the first time since Nuremberg, Nazi crimes were front and center, and the world realized the hunt wasn't over. If Eichmann was the most infamous Nazi captured, Josef Mengele was the most infamous not. Known as the Angel of Death, Mengele was a physician at Auschwitz who performed horrific medical experiments on twins, children, and pregnant women. He was never brought to justice. After the war, Mengele hid in Bavaria before escaping to Argentina in 1949. He later moved between Paraguay and Brazil, protected by a small circle of Nazi sympathizers. Despite repeated sightings and international pressure, Mengele was never captured. The Mossad came close in the 1960s but prioritized Eichmann instead. Mengele died in 1979, reportedly of a stroke while swimming at a beach in Brazil. He was buried under a false name. His remains were later exhumed and identified through forensic testing in the 1980s. His life in hiding, and the failure to capture him, haunted Nazi hunters and survivors for decades. In the decades after World War II, a small group of investigators, lawyers, and survivors dedicated their lives to hunting down fugitives. Their work was painstaking, often underfunded, and occasionally politically unpopular. Among the most famous was Simon Wiesenthal, a Holocaust survivor who helped locate over 1,000 war criminals. Operating out of Vienna, Wiesenthal combined detective work with public pressure, publishing names, issuing press releases, and refusing to let the world forget. His work inspired the Office of Special Investigations, OSI, in the United States, which began tracking down suspected Nazis who had immigrated under false pretenses. In Canada, Australia, and the UK, similar programs emerged, often decades late, but still determined to uncover the truth. One of the most dramatic pursuits came in the 1980s and 1990s as newly opened Soviet archives revealed fresh evidence on hundreds of war criminals who had escaped Europe. Suddenly, dormant investigations reignited, and names once forgotten returned to the headlines. The hunt for fugitives also birthed a cottage industry of myths and conspiracy theories. One persistent rumor claimed Adolf Hitler himself had escaped Berlin and fled to Argentina, living out his days in Patagonia under an assumed identity. Books and even TV specials entertained the idea, fueled by questionable witnesses and blurry photos. Historians dismiss these claims. All credible evidence points to Hitler's death in the Berlin bunker. But the persistence of the rumor reveals something deeper. The public's fear that evil, if not fully confronted, might continue in secret. Other theories suggested secret Nazi enclaves, entire villages in South America where German was spoken, swastikas hung on walls, and children were raised in admiration of the Third Reich. Some of these weren't entirely untrue. Communities with deep fascist sympathies did exist, and in places like Colonia Dignidad in Chile, Nazi fugitives lived undisturbed for years. The boundaries between truth and legend blurred, but the emotional resonance remained. The fugitives hadn't just escaped justice, they had evaded memory. In recent years, as archives opened and interest in World War II surged once again, new names began to surface. Some fugitives were found hiding in plain sight, living in the US, Canada, or Germany under their real names. In 2019, Jaku Palij, a former camp guard living in New York City since the 1940s, was deported to Germany at age 95. He died shortly afterward, but his case reignited calls for full transparency and accountability. Today, Germany maintains a dedicated unit of investigators focused exclusively on Nazi war crimes. Their goal isn't just to prosecute, but to document, to ensure no life, however long lived, ends without truth being named. The pursuit of Nazi fugitives is about more than punishment. It's about memory. It's about drawing a line between history and denial, between justice and forgetting. Every fugitive captured told the world that evil doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it wears a suit, or a passport, or a new name. And it doesn't always die with the war. It lingers until someone forces it into the light. The hunt was, and still is, about ensuring that the darkest chapter of the 20th century isn't rewritten by silence. Ideological descendants, families, and institutions. When the last shots of World War II were fired, the world thought it had defeated an evil regime. But what it didn't realize, at least not immediately, was that while the architects of the Reich were dead, or in hiding, their ideas weren't. Nazism, after all, wasn't just a set of uniforms or a dictator's speeches. It was a belief system, a toxic mix of racial supremacy, authoritarianism, anti-Semitism, and nationalist mythology. And belief systems don't die with surrender documents. They live on in silence, in stories told at kitchen tables, in children who inherit not only surnames, but legacies. This chapter is not about the fugitives or the war criminals. It's about those who came after, the children, the students, the institutions that bore the weight of a legacy many wanted to forget. Imagine being born to a man who helped orchestrate genocide, or to a woman who typed the orders that sent thousands to their deaths. For the children of high-ranking Nazis, life after the war came with a heavy inheritance. Some rejected it outright, others carried it like a secret, and a few, disturbingly, embraced it. Gudrun Himmler, daughter of SS Chief Heinrich Himmler, remained fiercely loyal to her father's memory long after the war. She joined far-right movements, helped Nazi fugitives escape justice, and never denounced the ideology that made her family infamous. To her, her father was a misunderstood patriot, not the architect of the final solution. But not all descendants followed that path. Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, became one of the most outspoken critics of his father's crimes. In interviews and books, he has publicly denounced his family legacy, calling his father a mass murderer and a disgrace. He believes silence is a second crime. Then there's Rainer Höss, grandson of Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. Rainer, disgusted by what his grandfather did, became an anti-Nazi activist. He has spoken at Holocaust memorials, met with survivors, and campaigned against extremism in Europe. These individuals represent a broader question. What does it mean to inherit guilt? And can it ever be redeemed? For the average German child born in the 1950s or 60s, the war was rarely discussed at home. Schools, still staffed by teachers who had worked under the Nazis, tiptoed around the subject. Textbooks omitted key facts. History lessons skipped from World War I straight to the Cold War. This wasn't accidental. It was strategic silence. In the early decades of West Germany, confronting the Nazi past was viewed as destabilizing. The economy needed rebuilding. The Cold War was intensifying. Dwelling on past atrocities, some argued, would only reopen wounds. So instead of addressing the Holocaust and the war head-on, many schools embraced what scholars call the myth of ignorance. Students were subtly taught that ordinary Germans didn't know what was happening in the camps, that the real blame lay only with a few evil men at the top. But silence has consequences. For decades, generations of Germans grew up without fully understanding the crimes of their grandparents, and in that vacuum, extremist ideas, never entirely extinguished, continued to flicker. It wasn't just families and schools that struggled with the Nazi past. Entire institutions, government offices, police departments, intelligence agencies, quietly absorbed former Nazis back into their ranks. In West Germany, the need for administrative expertise after the war led to a controversial decision: reintegrate rather than purge. By the mid-1950s, studies showed that up to 70% of the Justice Ministry's staff had once been members of the Nazi Party. Some had worked on racial purity laws or wartime courts. Others had helped prosecute resistance fighters. Now they were shaping democratic laws. The same was true in other institutions. Police departments were filled with officers who had once served in the Gestapo or SS. The Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, West Germany's foreign intelligence agency, was created by Reinhard Gehlen, a former Wehrmacht general who had collaborated with the Nazis. His organization recruited dozens of ex-SS men for Cold War espionage. Even the military, reborn as the Bundeswehr, quietly reinstated officers with troubling wartime records. This continuity had consequences. It slowed Germany's ability to reckon with its past. It created an institutional culture of denial. And in some cases, it enabled the quiet spread of old ideology under new uniforms. It wasn't until the 1960s that a cultural shift began. Younger Germans, raised in the shadow of silence, started asking uncomfortable questions. "What did you do during the war, father?" became the most painful sentence in German households. The student movement of 1968, partly inspired by global protests, turned its rage inward against its own history, its own elders, its own state. In response, West German schools began reforming their curricula. Holocaust education became mandatory. Memorials were erected. Public commemorations replaced quiet shame with open reflection. Institutions followed. By the 1990s and 2000s, German agencies began conducting internal investigations, publishing reports about Nazi ties in their history. They didn't always come voluntarily, but they came. The German government also began funding Holocaust education abroad, supporting Jewish communities, and participating actively in global remembrance efforts. The result? Today, Germany is one of the world's leading voices in confronting historical atrocity. But the ideological descendants of Nazism don't only live in guilt or apology. Some still live in resistance. Despite Germany's efforts, the ideology of the Third Reich never fully died. It mutated, found new voices, new symbols, new platforms. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, neo-Nazi movements began to re-emerge. At first, they were fringe, shaved heads, swastikas, illegal marches, but over time their language became more coded, their ideas more palatable. In recent years, Germany and much of Europe have seen the rise of far-right populist parties, some of which openly echo nationalist or xenophobic ideas that would have sounded familiar in 1930s Germany. And this isn't limited to Europe. In the US, Latin America, and parts of Asia, white supremacist and authoritarian movements have adopted Nazi symbolism, denied the Holocaust, or invoked purity language reminiscent of Hitler's ideology. What's most alarming is that many of these groups are populated not by old men reminiscing about the past, but by young people raised in a digital world where conspiracy theories spread like wildfire. Nazism today doesn't always come in the form of goose-stepping soldiers. Sometimes it comes as memes, as revisionist YouTube videos, as ironic swastikas posted online. And that's what makes it dangerous. The truth is, Nazism's legacy isn't just something you read in history books. It lives in courtrooms still prosecuting old crimes, in grandchildren asking hard questions, in classrooms teaching difficult truths, and yes, in dark corners of the internet where hatred finds a home. But it also lives in resistance, in descendants who broke with their past, in Germans who teach Holocaust education with honesty, and in nations who use history not to bury the past, but to illuminate the future. What we inherit is not always a choice, but what we do with that inheritance is. Echoes in modern extremism. The swastika may be banned in Germany. The Reich's flag may no longer fly, but the ideology it represented, racial supremacy, authoritarianism, and violent nationalism, never fully died. It simply changed form. In recent decades, as democracies grapple with economic anxiety, immigration debates, and disinformation, extremist ideas have found new ground. They no longer march in uniform, but they speak through nationalism, internet memes, and distorted history. Their slogans are rebranded, but the hatred is familiar. Across Europe, far-right parties have surged. In Germany, the Alternative for Deutschland, AfD, grew rapidly after 2013, shifting from anti-Euro rhetoric to anti-immigrant and anti-Islam positions. Some members have minimized the Holocaust, praised Wehrmacht soldiers, and criticized Germany's memorial culture. In France, Marine Le Pen's national rally reshaped her father's extremist party into a populist platform that promotes national identity and opposes immigration. Overt Nazi rhetoric is avoided, but the undertones remain, warning of a France threatened by outsiders. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán uses nationalist and revisionist narratives to consolidate power. He's praised Hungary's wartime leader Miklos Horthy, an ally of Hitler, and shifted blame away from Hungary's role in the Holocaust. Similar patterns appear in Austria, Italy, Poland, and the Netherlands. The far right is no longer fringe. It is reshaping national conversations and gaining real power. In the United States, far-right extremism has taken on distinctly American forms, but Nazi ideology lingers. Groups like Atomwaffen Division, the Base, and the National Socialist Movement openly admire Hitler, spread Nazi propaganda, and prepare for violence. They don't just echo the ideology, they quote it, tattoo it, and act on it. One of the starkest examples came in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 during the Unite the Right rally. White nationalists marched with torches chanting, "Jews will not replace us." Swastikas were visible. A white supremacist later rammed his car into a group of counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer. This wasn't an isolated outburst. It was part of a larger, deadly trend. In Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019, a gunman killed 51 Muslims at 2 mosques. His manifesto cited Hitler and fascist ideologies. He called his massacre a defense of Western civilization. Months later, in El Paso, Texas, another shooter killed 23 people at a Walmart, claiming he was stopping a Hispanic invasion. His manifesto echoed Nazi-style racial theories. In Norway, Anders Breivik murdered 77 people, mostly teenagers, at a political youth camp in 2011. His writings praised white nationalism and referenced Nazi racial ideas. These attackers didn't act in isolation. They were radicalized through online platforms where neo-Nazi ideologies thrive. Spaces like 8chan, 4chan, and Telegram groups where hate speech and extremist memes circulate freely. Digital spaces have become breeding grounds for extremism. Nazi propaganda that once required a printing press is now shared through memes, GIFs, and ironic humor. It's designed to seem harmless, until it isn't. Teenagers often encounter this content casually. It starts with edgy jokes, moves to historical revisionism, and eventually into full-fledged anti-Semitism or white supremacy. The gradual exposure dulls their ability to spot danger. And once inside these communities, leaving becomes difficult. Modern far-right movements also understand the power of aesthetics. They use high-quality videos, slick design, and humor to disguise their radical messages. What used to be blatant racism is now dressed as patriotism or free speech. But the message hasn't changed, only the method of delivery. Major platforms struggle to keep up. Even when accounts are banned, users reappear with new names. Algorithms often promote divisive content, pushing viewers toward more extreme views. Radicalization can happen quickly and silently. Another deeply disturbing echo of Nazi ideology is Holocaust denial. While it is illegal in Germany and several European countries, denial flourishes online. Conspiracy theorists claim gas chambers didn't exist, death tolls were inflated, and survivor testimonies were fabricated. These lies aren't new, they were circulated by the Nazis themselves. But now they spread faster and reach wider audiences. What's more worrying is how denial has reached younger generations. With fewer living survivors and gaps in education, some youths learn about the Holocaust through memes, or not at all. In some countries, textbooks minimize or omit their nation's role in World War II. In others, leaders downplay historical facts for political gain. This is not just ignorance, it's erasure. And erasure allows old ideologies to re-emerge unchecked. Yet there is resistance. For every hate-filled rally, there's a candle-lit vigil. For every extremist forum, there's a museum, a classroom, a teacher fighting back. Institutions like Yad Vashem, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, and Germany's Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe remind us of what happened and why it matters. Survivors continue to tell their stories. New projects like Eva. Stories bring Holocaust history to Instagram, reaching audiences where they already are. TikTok creators now debunk Holocaust denial and explain far-right dog whistles. Youth are no longer just targets of propaganda, they're becoming defenders of truth. And the courts haven't stopped either. Germany continues prosecuting the last living Nazi collaborators. These cases send a clear message. Complicity has consequences, even decades later. Why does this matter now? Because history doesn't repeat, it evolves. Hate returns under new names, symbols change, language shifts. But the core danger remains. Recognizing the echoes of Nazism in today's world isn't about dwelling on the past, it's about protecting the future, knowing the signs, calling them out, teaching others, and refusing to stay silent. Democracy isn't self-sustaining. It must be defended, daily, actively, and together. When we hear the echoes of the Reich, we must decide, ignore them or respond. Continuing reckoning, trials, memorials, and memory. The Third Reich fell in 1945, but justice, memory, and responsibility have carried on far beyond the war's end. In Germany and beyond, efforts to confront the crimes of the Nazi regime didn't stop with Nuremberg. Trials, memorials, education, and cultural reckoning became an ongoing process, a national and global duty. Because history doesn't stay buried, and neither should the truth. In recent years, Germany has prosecuted several elderly former Nazis, many in their 90s or even over 100. In 2022, a 101-year-old former SS guard at Sachsenhausen was convicted for his role in over 3,500 deaths. He wasn't sentenced for what he did personally, but for his participation in a system of extermination. These late trials aren't about retribution, they're about record, about making sure no perpetrator, however aged, dies unaccountable. The Zentrale Stelle in Ludwigsburg, the central office for investigating Nazi crimes, still operates today. Its mandate: pursue every viable case, no matter how much time has passed. Modern Germany doesn't avoid its past, it embeds it into everyday life. You can't walk far in Berlin without encountering a monument to Nazi victims. The most haunting are the Stolperstein, or stumbling stones, small brass plaques embedded in sidewalks outside homes, listing names and fates of those deported or murdered. Then there's the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, located just steps from the Reichstag. Its field of 2,711 concrete slabs doesn't explain, it confronts. The design invites reflection, not distraction. Other memorials commemorate Roma and Sinti victims, LGBTQ+ people, the disabled, political prisoners, and more. Germany ensures that remembrance is public, visual, and unavoidable. German students are required to study the Holocaust. Most visit former camps like Dachau or Buchenwald before graduation. Museums such as the Topography of Terror, built on the Gestapo HQ site, and the House of the Wannsee Conference confront visitors with documents, photos, and testimony, not to shock, but to educate. University research into Nazi crimes continues, including the complicity of doctors, teachers, judges, and ordinary police. The German government also funds Holocaust remembrance projects internationally. Acknowledging its responsibility doesn't stop at national borders. Still, remembrance is not immune to pushback. Far-right groups in Germany and elsewhere have vandalized memorials, disrupted ceremonies, and called for an end to what they call shame culture. Online, Holocaust denial spreads through forums and coded rhetoric. Revisionism is gaining footholds in parts of Eastern Europe, where nationalist governments seek to reframe their country's wartime roles. Even in Western democracies, debates around how to teach history often drift into political battlegrounds, minimizing or distorting the Holocaust and Nazi atrocities for ideological gain. Germany's post-war reparations began in the 1950s and continue today, with billions paid to survivors, Jewish communities, and the State of Israel. More recently, symbolic acts have complemented financial ones. German presidents have stood at Yad Vashem and Auschwitz and acknowledged national guilt unambiguously. German schools and community groups increasingly organize exchanges with Jewish communities and survivor families, encouraging honest dialogue across generations. The goal is not to erase guilt, but to use it, to teach, to warn, to prevent. As the last survivors and perpetrators pass away, memory becomes responsibility. Germany has embraced this reality. Its model, memorials, education, open archives, late trials, offers a roadmap for how nations can confront atrocity without defensiveness. Still, this reckoning is far from over. As authoritarian ideologies re-emerge and historical amnesia grows, the lessons of the Third Reich are more vital than ever. Because the fight isn't just against forgetting, it's against repeating. No top-tier Nazi leaders remain alive, but their legacy lingers. Some aging camp staff still face belated justice. Fugitives may still be hidden. Ideological currents persist through institutions, families, and digital extremism. Germany's enduring legal efforts, memorial landscape, and educational programs confront that legacy, but the lessons extend far beyond one nation. In a world where authoritarian ideologies can resurge, studying how the Third Reich's influence endures isn't mere history, it's a survival guide. Their echoes demand we remain vigilant, because democracy's strength lies not in burying the past, but in confronting its enduring shadows.